Have you ever wondered why the guys who are consistently killing the most hogs on their properties are almost never talking about exactly what they're doing? It's not modesty. It's because a good chunk of what actually works best in hog hunting sits in legal gray zones, or is outright prohibited in certain states, or runs up against regulations that were written with deer in mind and applied to hogs as an afterthought. The techniques on this list work. Some of them work better than anything else available, and most of them are restricted, banned, or require permits that the average private landowner will never obtain. What you're about to hear is the real list, the one that circulates at deer camp and on lease group chats, but rarely makes it onto a YouTube channel. Like, I've been running hogs for going on 17 years on private land in the South, and I've tried most of these firsthand, had to stop using some of them when regulations changed in my county, and watched other guys get more creative than I was comfortable being. Stick around to number 2, because the technique most hunters in legal states are still skipping is costing them 3 to 4 times their annual kill, and the entry cost is lower than most people assume. Before we start, check your state and local regulations for every single one of these. What's legal in Texas on private land is often a felony charge in California, and even within a single state, the rules can flip between public and private ground or county by county. That 5-minute check saves you a fine, a license suspension, and in some cases, a criminal record. This is information, not instruction. What you do with it is your call and your responsibility. Number 1 is hunting from a helicopter. In Texas, this is legal under the Aerial Wildlife Management Act, a law passed specifically because ground-based hunting couldn't put a meaningful dent in a population that can double in size every 14 months under good conditions. With a permit, a landowner or licensed contract pilot can take hogs from a moving aircraft with no bag limit. The results are not subtle. Operations running legally under this framework have taken 50 to 150 hogs in a single flight over a large property. The reason it's so effective is simple. Hogs have no defense against a threat that comes from above at 80 miles per hour. They can't associate the sound of a distant helicopter with danger the way they've learned to associate ATVs, rifle shots, and human foot traffic with threat. A mature boar that has been pressured for 3 years on the ground and moves only between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. has exactly zero behavioral adaptation for a helicopter that appears over the treetops. The aerial take permits are not freely available to individual private landowners in Texas in most cases. You typically need to work with a licensed aerial management contractor. The per hog cost when you factor in flight time makes it economically viable only at scale, meaning larger properties with significant damage problems. Outside of Texas and a small number of other states with similar provisions, yes, aerial take of wildlife from moving aircraft is a federal felony under the Airborne Hunting Act of the 1971. Don't improvise on this one. Number 2 is thermal and night vision optics for shooting, and this one splits hard by state. In Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and most of the Southeast, hunting hogs at night with thermal or night vision is perfectly legal on private land. In California, it's banned. In several other states, it's banned for hogs specifically, or permitted only with written landowner permission submitted to the state in advance. The effectiveness of thermal at night is worth understanding. A hog at 200 yards, about the length of 2 football fields end to end, lights up on a quality thermal scope the way a campfire lights up in a dark field. Their body temperature relative to the cool ground at night creates a heat signature that a thermal unit picks up from distances that make rifle shooting practical with no artificial light required. The ATN Thor 4 and the Pulsar Trail 2 LRF are the units most commonly referenced in the field, because they hold zero reliably across temperature swings, which matters when you're hunting in humidity that varies 40 degrees between sunset and midnight. If you're in a legal state and you're not hunting hogs with thermal at night, you're leaving the majority of your annual kill on the table. Most hog movement on pressured properties happens between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Daylight and crepuscular hunting is catching the edges of a much larger pattern. And the guy who shoots 60 hogs a year on his lease and the guy who shoots 12 are usually running the same ground. The difference is almost always whether one of them is out there at midnight with a thermal and the other is sleeping. Number 3 is snares on active hog trails. A cable snare set correctly on a heavily used hog run which is a worn path through brush or across a creek crossing that looks like someone took a riding mower down a deer trail through thick cover, will catch hogs at a rate that no passive bait setup can match. You're not waiting for the hog to find the bait. You're intercepting them on a route they've been running for years, sometimes for generations, because hog travel corridors get passed down through sounder behavior. The problem is that cable snares are banned or heavily restricted in most states when used as a hunting tool. The concern from wildlife agencies is non-selectivity. A snare on a hog trail will catch whatever walks that trail, including deer, coyotes, and domestic dogs. In states where they're legal with restrictions, the snare diameter and loop height specifications for hogs are usually different from general trapping regulations. If you're in a legal state, the setup that produces the most consistent results is a loop roughly 12 inches in diameter, about the size of a standard wall clock, set at a height of about 8 inches off the ground, which is roughly the height of a coffee mug standing upright, on a run that shows fresh tracks both directions. Not one directional movement, which is a spooked or exploring animal. Both directions, which is a committed travel corridor. Cable gauge matters. Hogs have more raw strength than most people expect, and a light gauge snare gets broken or pulled out regularly on anything above 150 pounds. Use aircraft cable at minimum for boars. Number 4 is diesel-soaked corn. Pour roughly a quarter cup of diesel fuel, about what fits in a standard coffee mug, over a 30-pound corn pile before you set it out. Let it sit overnight to absorb before deploying. The diesel scent travels far in still air. Hogs follow petroleum-based smells with a consistency that nobody has cleanly explained to me in biological terms. And the secondary effect is that white-tailed deer won't touch a pile that smells like a gas station. If deer are cleaning out your feeder before hogs get to it, diesel corn solves the problem overnight. The legal issue is that, in several states, adding any foreign substance to wildlife feed is classified as adulteration and is prohibited under wildlife code. It also runs into environmental regulations near water in most jurisdictions. Keep it well away from any drainage, stock pond, or stream, at minimum 200 yards from any standing water. On open upland agricultural ground with no adjacent water, the enforcement risk varies by county. The old-timers in South Texas and along the Lavaca River bottom have been doing this for decades and treat it as completely standard. Whether that makes it fine or just commonly overlooked depends on your county game warden's perspective, and that perspective varies more than most people realize. Tricks like these plus 65 more are what I organized into the Hog Hunter's Bible. 80 field-tested techniques, and each with the reasoning behind it so you know why it works, not just what to do. Bait science, feeder timing, trap pre-baiting, night hunting setups, and a chapter on reading hog behavior when they get educated and stop showing up during daylight. One-page field reference in the back you can print and take with you. Links in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen if you're watching on a TV. Number 5 is sow estrus urine as a hog attractant. Mature boars respond to estrus scent from sows in a way that bypasses their normal caution around established food sites. A boar that won't approach a feeder he's identified as a pressure point will sometimes walk directly to an estrus scent, drag from a different direction entirely, because the hormonal trigger overrides his learned threat association. This is the same behavioral override that makes mock scrapes and estrus drags effective for mature whitetail bucks. The reproductive drive competes with and sometimes beats the survival drive. For hogs, the effect is even more pronounced because boars roam larger territories and cover more ground, looking for estrus sows than bucks do. Looking for does. A boar that has been dark for weeks on camera at your feeder may respond to estrus scent set 80 to 100 yards from the feeder, roughly the length of a basketball court, plus the width of a road, in a location he hasn't associated with pressure. Several states extended their urine-based attractant bans, originally written for deer over CWD contamination concerns, to cover all wildlife species. The language in some of those bans explicitly says cervid urine and nothing else. The language in others says any urine-based attractant. Before you use any urine-based product for hogs, read the actual text of your state's regulation, not someone's summary of it. The distinction between cervid-specific and all-species language matters, and the answers vary widely by state. Number 6 is buried fermented bait, what most people call the whole method or hog slop. Dig a hole roughly 12 inches deep, about the depth from your wrist to your elbow, and the diameter of a coffee can. Fill it with fermented corn, and cover it loosely with 2 to 3 inches of dirt. Hogs smell the fermentation underground, root to access it, and stay on site for 30 to 45 minutes instead of the 8 to 10 minutes they spend on a surface pour. On the cameras, I've run over hole setups versus surface pours on the same property in the same week. The time on site difference is consistent and not close. The technique itself is straightforward. The legal issue is that baiting hogs at all is banned in California, on most public land in Georgia and several other states, and in any jurisdiction where baiting regulations don't distinguish between hog-specific bait and general wildlife bait. On private land in Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and most of the Southeast, this is standard practice with no legal exposure whatsoever. The Georgia DNR has published the sour corn recipe on their own website as part of hog management guidance, which tells you everything about how that state views it on private ground. The self-check here is straightforward. If you're on private ground in a core hog state with liberal baiting regulations, the whole method is legal and it works. And if you're anywhere near public land, a state line, or a jurisdiction with strict baiting rules, confirm before you dig. Number 7 is electronic distress calls and electronic feeding calls used as active hunting aids. A recording of hog feeding sounds, grunting, or piglet distress can pull hogs in from distances that passive bait alone won't reach, especially on pressured properties where sounders have become call-shy to predator distress. Piglet distress is the most effective trigger I've run personally. A mature sow with shoats will cover ground toward that sound that she wouldn't cover toward corn. The instinct is hardwired, and it doesn't educate the same way that location-based pressure does. The restriction is that in several states, using any electronic caller as a hunting aid for any species is prohibited, and a few states have specific language around electronic calls for hogs. More commonly, the restriction is on electronic calls for fur bearers and predators, and hogs fall outside that language. The answer depends on your state's specific wildlife code language, not on general principles. This is one of the more commonly overlooked restrictions because hunters assume hog regulations are always the most liberal option, and that's not universally true. I ran an electronic feeder call setup on a property in Washington County, Georgia for 2 seasons, and it produced results that a static bait site couldn't match on educated sounders. Then the state updated guidance, and I checked again to be sure I was still legal. I was, but I came closer than I would have liked to not checking. Unit placement matters. The caller needs to be at the bait site. Not near your stand, so the audio source draws movement toward the shooting lane rather than toward you. Number 8 is body gripping traps, specifically Conibear-style traps set on hog runs or den entrances. A properly sized body gripping trap set on an active hog crossing is among the fastest dispatch methods available for individual animals. The mechanical engagement is immediate. The result is immediate. And there's no educated animal that can see what it's walking into, the way it can see a corral trap from 50 yards. A corral trap, which is a large panel enclosure designed to catch an entire sounder at once, is something hogs learn to avoid after 1 or 2 exposures. A conibear set inside a natural pinch point in thick brush is something they have no behavioral defense against because it doesn't look different from the trail they've run 1,000 times. The restrictions are significant. Conibear traps are banned by size for hog-specific use in multiple states, require permits in others, and are prohibited entirely in several jurisdictions due to non-selectivity concerns identical to those around snares. Where they're legal, the minimum jaw spread for hogs of any useful size is roughly the width of a standard laptop screen, about 14 to 16 inches across. A pipe or culvert set is the most practical configuration because it channels approach naturally and reduces non-target exposure. I won't pretend I've never used one. I also won't tell you where. Lesson number 9 is carbon monoxide fumigation of underground dens and burrows. This is emerging technology that's been reviewed by several state wildlife agencies and is currently in a regulatory gray zone in most of the country. The principle is straightforward. Hogs use large underground dens in some terrain types, particularly in sandy or loamy soils along creek banks and in brushy draws, and a controlled CO introduction can clear a den without surface disturbance. The equipment sold commercially for this application is designed for agricultural pest control and is marketed for gopher and ground squirrel control, not hog control specifically, which creates an ambiguity about whether using it for hogs falls under its labeled use. The regulatory status of using it specifically as a hog hunting method is genuinely unsettled in most states. And I mean that literally. I called my county game warden about this once, and he paused for a long time and said he'd have to call the regional office. He called me back 2 days later and said the regional office wasn't sure either. I've seen it used once on a property in Drew County, Arkansas, by a guy who'd been dealing with a specific sounder that was denning under a brush pile in a creek bottom and wouldn't approach any surface bait setup. It worked. Whether it was legal under Arkansas regs at that time is something I couldn't tell you with confidence, and I'm fairly sure he hadn't asked anyone either. The technology exists, and it works. The legal framework to use it for hog hunting hasn't caught up yet in most jurisdictions, which means the answer you get depends almost entirely on how your specific state wildlife code is written and whether hogs are classified as wildlife, agricultural pests, or invasive species under that code. All three classifications exist across different states, and they lead to very different regulatory outcomes. Number 10 is sodium nitrite bait, and I want to be straight about what this is and why it's on the list. Sodium nitrite is atoxicant, meaning a substance designed to kill through ingestion, not a hunting method in the traditional sense. It was reviewed by the EPA for civilian use in the United States as a hog control tool under the product name Hog Gone, which was developed in Australia where it has been used under controlled conditions. The EPA's review process for civilian use in the United States did not result in approval. It is legal under permit for certified wildlife agency use only in a very small number of states, which makes it effectively banned for civilian use in 49 states as of the last information I have. I'm including it because it appears in hog management discussions constantly, and people hear about it from wildlife agency presentations and want to understand what it is. The compound works based on a specific difference in hog physiology. Hogs lack adequate levels of the methemoglobin reductase enzyme that allows other mammals to survive elevated nitrite concentrations in the bloodstream. Deer, cattle, and dogs can metabolize doses that are lethal to hogs. That species selectivity is real, and it was the basis for the EPA review. The reason the review didn't result in civilian approval is that even with that selectivity, the risk of secondary poisoning of scavengers feeding on hog carcasses was not resolved to the agency's satisfaction, and the certification and monitoring requirements for responsible deployment were considered impractical for wide civilian use. If you're interested in how this technology works, the USDA Wildlife Services Program has published research on it. If you're hoping to use it on your own property, you're not going to be able to obtain it legally. This is not something a private landowner can get through a feed store or online. It belongs on this list as context, not as a method, because the gap between what's being discussed in wildlife agency circles and what hunters hear secondhand at camp creates a lot of confused conversations. Someone always knows a guy who knows a guy. Usually that guy doesn't know what he thinks he knows. This system and 65 more field-tested techniques are all in the Hog Hunter's Bible. 80 tricks total, every one of them with the reasoning behind it. Bait science, trap timing, feeder placement, night hunting, and a chapter on hog behavior under pressure. One-page field reference card in the back. Links in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen. A few things worth saying before you go out and try to act on any of this. The legal landscape around hog hunting is the most variable of any game species in the country because hogs occupy a regulatory no-man's land between wildlife and invasive pest. In some states, they have zero protections. In others, the regulations governing them are almost as complex as deer hunting. Yet it's the same technique can be completely legal on your private land in Texas and a criminal charge on public land in the next state over. The updates come fast because state legislatures and wildlife agencies are actively trying to expand control options every year. A regulation that was gray in 2022 might be explicitly permitted in 2024, or explicitly banned. The only way to know is to check your current state and county regs, not to ask someone at deer camp who hunted a different state. I've been caught off guard twice in my own county when regulations changed mid-season. It happens. Check before you set anything up, not after. What I'd encourage you to do with this list is think about which techniques fall clearly within what's legal on your specific ground and start there. For most hunters in the Southeast on private land, so that means night hunting with thermal is on the table right now, if you don't have it in your rotation yet. The difference in kill rate between a hunter running thermal on a good night setup and a hunter hunting the same property without it is not marginal. It's 3 to 5 times the annual take on comparable ground. That gap is not about skill. It's about being on the right side of the 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. movement window that pressure has pushed most educated sounders into. If you're in a legal state and you haven't made that transition, that's the first move. A used ATN Thor 4 runs around $600, roughly what you'd spend on 2 full seasons of commercial attractants that probably aren't performing, as well as the techniques we covered in the sour corn video. My wife had opinions about the thermal purchase. She stopped having them around the 3rd month when the freezer situation became undeniable. I count that as a win. After thermal, the buried bait method with the hanging bag is the technique with the highest immediate return on pressured private ground in legal baiting states. The entry cost is a post-hole digger and a bag of corn. The change in sounder commitment time from surface pours to buried setups is real, and it shows up on your camera the first week you run it. Those two things together, thermal night hunting and the buried bait system, are the foundation of what the most productive private land hog hunters are running in the South right now. The rest of this list is context, legal education, and an honest accounting of why your property might still have more hogs on it than you can kill. You're killing 20 a year, and the damage isn't going down because a sow at 6 months old is already pregnant, and the math never goes your way on the ground. The tools exist. Most of them are sitting in a legal gray zone. A few of them are locked behind permits that cost more than they're worth for an individual hunter. And one of them, as of right now, isn't available to you at all, regardless of how well it works. That's the honest picture. Make your decisions accordingly.